in the US, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening to Asia. I'm happy to see you here. We're now on our final with this Let's Build session by Rob Hausam. He'll be talking about concept maps and naming system and how and when to use them, and the proposed changes in R5. We're looking forward to all that. Rob is calling in from Missouri, from the state of Missouri, and without further ado, let him introduce himself and kick off.
All right, thank you, Gustav. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, do so. So just one quick thing. We'll be taking questions in Zoom. You're allowed to actually unmute yourself. Please, after speaking, mute yourselves again. That would help a lot getting the session through.
Let me get to the right spot here. There we go. All right, well, welcome everyone. We're here at the very last, last bit of DevDays this time. I think it's been a really good meeting, and appreciate everybody coming to this session. This is basically a follow-on to the one that I did yesterday. This is the Let's Build, so plan to do this bit more, try to make it even more interactive and ad hoc, and basically explore things that you are interested in, and feel, definitely you can unmute yourselves and we can just talk through things and kind of explore how the operations that we're going to look at work and things like that. So please feel free to make comments and ask questions or suggest things you want to take a look at, or anything you don't understand, any of those kinds of things. That would be great. That's what we, again, definitely try to make this as hands-on as possible. So with that, let me take a couple of seconds to introduce myself. I'm Rob Hausam. I go by Rob. I'm an MD, a family physician here in the States, but I'm also a consultant in informatics. I've got a electrical and computer engineering background. I was an engineer before I was a doctor, and I've always tried to do the two together. And it's been a kind of a fun ride over a long time. I've been working with HL7 for since about 2001 in various aspects, and I wasn't the very first with Fire, not quite at the same point as Graham Grieve and Lloyd McKenzie and Ewa Kramer, but fairly soon thereafter I started working with Fire, and I've been a very strong advocate of that, for a number of years now. And I work as at work, but I'm one of the co-chairs of the vocabulary work group, and also orders and observations work groups in HL7. So that's a little bit about me. So as far as today, again, I'm going to try to pick up a bit from where we left off yesterday, and I know that some of you weren't here yesterday, so we'll maybe do a little bit of a quick recap. I don't have a lot of slides actually, so in fact they're kind of a little bit skimpy, on the skimpy side, but this is new material. I've not tried to teach this before, at least not before yesterday anyway, but we will go ahead and get into it. And we have 40 minutes goes by pretty quickly, so I'll go through these first slides quite quickly, and this mostly is just a review. These are learning objectives that we put together for this. You can read through those or them as you want, and we'll try to keep on that those main ideas anyway. So let's see. So I started off talking about where you find these terminology resources in the spec, and it's kind of front and center in the terminology section, and ConceptMap and NamingSystem are the two that we're talking about today and yesterday. So ConceptMap resource. So this is just an example, and I'm going to skip over that quickly. Like I said, we'll get into some kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. There's some new things. The slides are basically the same as what we had yesterday, but we've made some updates and have added some new things that we'll try to talk about a little further today. And again, any of you who are repeat comers, go ahead and finish your questions. I tried to answer any remaining questions that we hadn't gotten to yesterday. Tried to do that during my early morning, I guess it was today, but I may have missed some things. So let's make sure we try to get all the questions answered. I'll try to leave plenty of time for that. So let's see, this, I showed the UML diagram of the resource because you can get that in the specification. This just talks about what's the purpose, of concept map. It's a state of relationships from one set of concepts to another one. And these can be, the notion of concept here, as I said yesterday, was pretty broad. It's typically going to be codes in a code system of some kind, but it isn't always. And that's one of the things I'll give you a little more detail on today than I did yesterday. But it could be other things, can actually be data elements or classes and class models, various kinds of things like that. That anything where you could basically, have a list of items and want to map those to another list, essentially, we can probably accommodate that. I had some questions about that yesterday, and again, we can drill into that further if folks are interested in trying to do that. So we define mappings and we do them in a context. So they are, that's why we basically typically specify that it's a value set that we're mapping. So let's switch, let's see, next slide here. And again, just kind of repeating what we covered yesterday. That's what I just said about the context dependent, the source X and target X elements refer to value sets, not to code systems directly. Although it is worth noting that every code system, basically has an all codes value set, and oftentimes you may want to use that. That can either be just the actual code system URL. If you use that as, it implicitly means the value set of all codes in this code system. So you certainly can do that. If that's the appropriate context, then that's fine. And some code systems have other specific value sets to URLs to use for that purpose, and you can do that. Mappings are unidirectional. You can reverse them with the reverse parameter, but that doesn't really give you a reverse mapping. It just tells you what's the set of source concepts that are mapped to the target. Okay. So this is the part that I want to drill into a little bit further than I did yesterday, and that's on the notion of implicit code systems. These code systems are not necessarily based on some kind of a recognized terminology. They're, like say SNOMED CT or LOINC or, RX norm or ATC or, AMT in Australia for medications. There's obviously we have a lot of code systems out there, but those are, typically more formal and recognized ones. But there's a lot of things that can at least logically be considered to be a set of concepts that you could usefully map. So let's see if we can drill into that a little bit. So this next slide is the one that I didn't show yesterday. And this comes actually taken from the specification. And it's basically, this is 3 possible implicit code systems that might be there. There's definitely plenty of other ones, but you could have, you basically a set of structure definitions. Again, the structure definition URL, the canonical URL for that is considered to be the system. And then, so this is within a single structure definition is what this is talking about. And, all the snapshot element IDs could be considered to be codes in the code system. And that's something that, I have to admit that I don't really tend to think about it that way, but, and I don't know if I've seen anyone actually try to make use of this. Now, I'd be interested to know if any of you out there have looked at that and have any experience attempting to do that in any kind of a real system or exchange. Because actually, I'll say I haven't personally done that with structure definitions, but it is something that you can do. And you can do a similar thing with questionnaire. The item link IDs in the snapshots would be considered to be codes. And then you get to the example here of medications. And I mentioned this one yesterday, but I wasn't showing a slide for it. but medication resources are a little different. They don't have a canonical URL, so we don't have multiple items within a single resource. But there, the notion of that is that we would refer to, basically to the endpoint, the fire server base medication endpoint, and then essentially the logical ID, the ID element in the resource itself would be considered to be the code. And I actually have an example that illustrates that a little bit, which I'm going to show you here now. I guess I can switch over. We can go over to the spec and kind of see how some of this looks a little bit. Let me start maybe going back to the spec here with ConceptMap. This is where we are. I'm in an R4 release right now. We did talk yesterday about the changes, upcoming proposed changes to ConceptMap in R5, and I may touch back on that here again in a little bit, but I don't want to spend too much time talking and more trying to show things. But anyway, so let's see where I want to go with that. We've got, again, we got our source X and target X elements, which are references, either URI references or actual canonical references to a value set resource. And those are supposed to set the context for what we're doing. We also have, somewhat confusingly, at least sometimes it can be, we also have group.source and group.target. And those are explicitly references, they're URI references to to the code system. That would be the same as what would be used in coding.system or, so in the data types. But anyway, so let's see. So what we're talking about with implicit code systems is we're going to set what our value sets are. So like if we were talking about that list of medication resources, that would be, that medication-based endpoint would be we'd use the URI for that as our source. That's our source value set. And then each individual resource ID would be basically be in our, we got a group, grouped, excuse me, let me say this right. So we specify our source and target up front here, and then in our element, in our group element, then we have the source code. So the source code itself would be the ID of that medication resource. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me see if I can maybe illustrate that a little bit. I was gonna do this by, might be jumping in the middle here. This is, well, we'll do that, and I will go back to where maybe the context of where this comes from, make it a little clearer. But this is in the LIVID, the LOINC in vitro diagnostics IGs, one of the IGs that I'm working on myself, and we use ConceptMap there, and we're using it to relate observation definitions, basically, and map those to LOINC codes that would be the recommended codes for those particular observations. So the observation definition was not listed in that, in the spec as one of the possible, code systems, but it fills the same, kind of place, I think, as the medication resources do. So we've got a collection of observation definitions, and so we're saying that this is our source URI. Now we're just basically using, I'm trying to think of the right word to use, but not a full URI for that. So just the resource name itself is our source. And so it's, again, implies it's a set of those resource instances. And then our target is, is our LIVID value set for LOINC. And so basically what we have here is, again, group element, our source code is this is, and we're using GUIDs as our resource identifier. So this is the one of the codes which references one of those observation definition resources. So hopefully that makes some sense. This is kind of really experimental stuff. I mean, we're using it in the IG. It's a representation that I think works and is, certainly in the spirit of and conformant with the specification. There's not really any tooling around this. So it's kind of explore this area, your own interest and risk, I guess. One of the things I did mention in an answer to a question from yesterday was talking about, I guess, support for this idea, at least generally it was kind of along those lines. And one thing maybe to note, if we go back here to ConceptMap, just a minute, scroll back up and let's go look at the operations. So the translate operation is the main way that we access concept maps and can make use of those. And if we look at it, what we see, if we look a little closer at the parameters, we'll basically see that we can pass it, an input parameters code, which is the code to be translated with a system, and or we can use coding and codable concept. And I think the operation was, developed around the general notion that these are actually going to be codes in recognized code systems. They're going to have, a code value and a system URI, and it's going to be something that the terminology server can know about, so that it can actually do the translation. If we started trying to do things like collections of medication resources or observation definitions, I don't think there's any terminology server on the planet that's going to know exactly what to do with that. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, maybe you can build that into your own systems if that's something that you're going to be working with. All right. So I'm talking quite a bit, and I'd like to open it up and see if folks have comments or questions about this bit about implicit code systems. I've got a little more on that, or if you have any other more general questions or anything about ConceptMap and anything that I obviously skipped into that really over things very quickly. So maybe there are some specific things we would like to talk about, and please ask away or comment away. Anything, particularly if you've done anything in this space or anything, or have any insights into it, that would be great to share. Was it?
I think Morten's trying to speak.
Yeah, I was wondering, because I have a general question which isn't about this implicit system stuff. So I just want to make sure that I'm not shoving anybody out of the way who have a question about that in particular. Because mine is more general. I'm just wondering if you talk something about. So you talked yesterday about how to use, if you have a terminology server, and use it in the translate operation. But I'm wondering if you could tell me about other ways to basically, let's say, execute these maps, right? So suppose I have a use case where I say I have a bunch of resources. I know they have codes in, I don't know, Loink, and I want to have them in SNOMED, and I have a concept map that does that mapping. Right. So are there other tools or experience with other things of running them? I guess you could also do it with Hoppy somehow, but are there other tools for just saying, basically saying, take these resources, go through, and if you find one of the codes you know how to map, then please map them and output them accordingly, or basically in general other ways of executing these maps on artifacts that have used these codings and where you want them mapped.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I have to say I don't have I'll tell you what what I guess I do know, which isn't much. I'm not really aware that there are other things out there. I mean, it translates the obvious way that the power of the concept map is exposed. I can certainly imagine that people will, as I was saying, will do this and may have built internal tooling or other things to leverage these. I am curious, this is a question I think for the group, are there experiences out there? Do folks know of other tools or other systems that you built yourself or worked with that do this? Because I'm not coming up with anything that I know of specifically other than Translate at the moment. But I expect there will be. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? And Morten, do you have any other? I mean, are you asking for a particular reason, or have you thought about doing this, or what's the kind of?
I mean, I guess I have one context maybe where I thought, I mean, I can say I've only sort of speculated about, I haven't really done anything, unfortunately, as you can perhaps tell by my question. But one thing I was sort of thinking about, and this is something that came out in the context of something we did in the spring for COVID. And basically there were sort of some cases where we use law encodes, and then the community, or in German, people sort of converged on SNOMEDs and so on. And so I was wondering about, okay, so we have questionnaires where we code things. Maybe we want to align those with the sort of where people converge on, say, using SNOMED, but we have old data with answers in LOINC, right? So then I'm thinking about, okay, how can I how can I migrate my data forward if I have non-breaking changes? Like I say, I just flip the code from one system to another in this particular question, and basically have existing data and move it forward. So even if this coding is changing, I can always bring all the data with me, and wondering about how to use ConceptMap to do something like that. And this is maybe another thing about execution in the context of maybe of the mapping language or something. So that was sort of the concrete, stray thought.
No, those are good thoughts, and I think you're on the right track with that. And I think this is area and fodder for experimentation. Potentially bringing it to one or more connectathon tracks, or just trying it out on yourself, or asking folks on Zulip, and maybe you're doing some collaboration. I don't know, see where we go with this, but I think that ConceptMap can play a role in what I think you're describing anyway. So that's my take, but I don't have a whole lot more insight. I don't think I'm many steps ahead of really where you are with that, but I think I think it makes sense to explore it.
Right. And is it correct that it is actually, you can sort of use the concept map in the mapping language? I'm not sure if I get this right. If you take...
I'm not sure if I'm going to actually know the answer to that question, but what do you, when you say use the concept map in the mapping language?
I guess, so maybe I've just dreamt that this was possible, but say you map a resource to another resource the same type, and in some field you basically want to say, okay, when you map this field, please apply this concept map, right? So maybe it's a code, and it'll say something like, here's a code of field. I know I have them in LOINC. I have a map that takes that LOINC into a SNOMED. Now please apply that and flip my code. Something like that. Maybe I'm just dreaming that this is...
Well, no, I don't know. You might not be. I mean, honestly, I haven't explored the mapping language. I actually don't know the answer to the question, so I'm not going to attempt to pretend that I do. So, but I think it's a good question. Yeah, I'd like to actually know the answer to that myself, and maybe
So actually, you'd have to have your mapping engine called a $translate operation.
Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah,
you'd have to pass it on to your terminology server or whatever application you have. So I can follow up on that.
Yeah, thanks, Gustav. That does make sense. Yeah, that would be the way to tie them together, probably. Yeah. All right, I'm going to switch slides here. Let's see. I put a little more information on the implicit code systems, and I'll move on here in a second to some more naming system stuff. But there's a couple of sections in the specification here, 410.9 under ConceptMap and 4.8.15 under code system, where you can get more details. Maybe I'll just click on this one right now, show where this is. There's this draft section here in the spec on implicit code systems. It's kind of interesting reading. It's definitely, grayed out and kind of flagged as experimental and undergoing review, even though the resource itself is normative, but this is very drafty. It may give you some useful ideas, and we can further develop this kind of as we go along here. So, all right. Yeah, any other comments, questions, or anything at this point?
Hello, Rob.
Yeah.
I have a query related to code system and value set. So while doing implementation, is it necessary to have a value set for each codable concept, or we can directly check with the code system as well? We can directly call the code system.
Okay, so let me, maybe I can have you kind of try to restate your question. I think I pretty much got it, but are you saying are you talking about when you're using ConceptMap and the translate operation, or are you talking about something a little different than that?
And I'm talking about codable concept in resource. So we have elements with codable concept. At that
Right.
time, we refer to value set, right?
All right. So well, maybe just see if we can take a look at it a little bit. Try to answer that question. Oh, sorry, too far. If I just drill in on it, I'll just pick on a codable concept somewhere. I should have one. This is one resource I probably don't actually. But we can just go to the data types. So we can pick on codable concept here. All right, so you're saying you're in codable concept, and I think you're talking about you're saying. I think what I heard was you're saying, do I have to refer to the value set or go directly to the code system? Well, the answer, I think, to your question, is, I'll let you elaborate on that and make sure I got it right in a second. But the guts of codable concept is, of course, one or more codings. And so if we drill it, well, actually, let's do it directly here. Hit on the coding, go to the coding data type. And, so basically we're here. And so when we talk about our system, we're definitely talking about the code system. We're not talking about the value set at this point. The value set comes in the element definition binding, the example, preferred, extensible, required binding to a value set. But in any data instance, you're referring directly to the code system. Is that the question you're asking, basically? Or?
So yeah, I know here the code system URL should be mentioned in this, but if I'm doing the implementation of terminology server, so in that terminology server, I should have value sets for each coding, or I can use the code system as a whole.
Okay, well, okay, so I think I mentioned that earlier too. I mean, you have flexibility. It's whatever is the right context for what you're doing. So if you happen to be using a code system where using, I don't know what's a good example. You probably have some on top, in your mind, but smaller code systems, particularly where they're kind of for a specific purpose, you might be considering, well, it could be any of these codes in this entire code system, and so I can make my value set I'm going to bind to or reference is going to be, it's going to include all the codes in the code system. And but if you're talking about some of the other contexts, like working with SNOMED CT, and you need some specific part of it, then you need a more specific value set.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So let's move on the slides here a bit. I think we have any more detail here. We talked about translate yesterday, and we've just been talking about it a little bit more. I have an example of the translate here. I showed it yesterday. I don't think I'll show it again right now unless there's a specific question about it. But you can do that if you didn't get that yesterday. I'm trying to be cognizant of time and we're actually getting pretty close. So I need to get on to doing a little more naming system stuff. So I'm going to skip through these, but these are those proposed changes. And what I wanted to add on naming system, let's skip through this, is more, I gave actually the slides were a little bit out of date yesterday, and they had the wrong example in there. So I didn't actually get to the preferred ID example. So I was going to show that here real quick, and then also the proposed new operation. And so we'll just kind of end with this for the next few minutes, I think. And so here's the naming system resource that we're looking at, but that looks real ugly. So that's not going to be very helpful to look at. So if I go here, I've prettied it up a bit, and you can see it's fairly simple naming system, which basically takes, this is about SNOMED CT, and it takes the OID that references SNOMED CT, say if you were using it in CDA or potentially in other places, particularly CDA in HL7 version 3, you'd be using this OID to represent SNOMED. But in FHIR, we use URIs or hopefully resolvable URLs, and this is the FHIR URL, of course, for SNOMED CT. And so we want to use naming system to assert the equivalences and be able to leverage that. So that's what we're doing there. And go on to the next slide. I've got three queries here that we can take a look at. First one is just the basic one where say I'm going to, what's the preferred ID in this case, if I don't happen to know that already, which of course I do. But if I'm coming from the CDA world and I want to, find out what I should be using in Fire, I can give it the CDA, excuse me, the OID, and I can say, but what I want is the URI for this. I want to know what that is. I actually don't know it. So I'll ask the server and it can tell me. And we don't have to, it's easy to see there. The answer in that case is, of course, the SNOMED CT URL. So that's a simple one. Okay. If we do the other thing, we could also do this. We could say, I actually have the URL, but is this really the preferred one? Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm not sure why I wouldn't know that, but if I didn't know that, I could say, well, I've got this URL for SNOMED, but I want to make sure I get the preferred URI. So I'll ask the server that. And of course, when I do, the answer is going to be the same. It tells me that, yeah, that is in fact the preferred URL that I can use for SNOMED CT. But if I ask a third question, and this one down here, I got to move this out of my screen. So instead, I can ask it, I've got the URL, and I'm going to say, what if I actually would prefer to have the OID? Could I ask the server about that? So I'm going to ask the group, what do you expect the output should be for this? If I looked at the map, it's got both the the OID and the the URI there. So if I ask this, should it be able to answer me? Give me an OID? What do you think? We don't have a lot of time, so I won't wait for too many answers, but when we try it, this is what we get. Now this is in one server. This is in Peter Jordan's, the New Zealand Termin server, and he's probably done more with this than anybody else that I know of, except for Onto server in Australia has done a lot as well. But I'm just sticking with the Termin server today. But so this doesn't work. I think it should work. I don't see any reason. Well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I apologize for that. Actually, this doesn't work, and there is a reason why this doesn't work, and that's because we asked for the preferred identifier. And if you remember, looked at this, and the only one that's marked as preferred is the SNOMED URL. So if we ask for the OID and we're asking a preferred ID, it's going to give you what we just got. You're going to get some kind of a message and some kind of an error, this operation outcome in this case. All right, so that's not maybe very useful. Maybe we do want to be able to translate this, and that's where we get to this proposed new operation. Again, and this is Peter Jordan that has requested this actually, and he's implemented it in his server, and we'll just hone it right into that. It's this, well, okay. I will also mention quickly that we are talking about renaming one of the parameters for preferred ID for the preferred ID operation, renaming ID to identifier, because that turned out to be confusing in some places. But that's another thing. It's probably going to happen in R5. But now let's get on to the, Peter's proposed this new operation, translate ID, to be able to do the thing I was just trying to ask about. What if you actually want to convert, from the OID to the URL, or from the URL to the OID? Can you do that? So the new operation gives you the ability to maybe be able to ask that question. Now the naming system resource is the same, and so I'll skip over that. But so we've got two queries we can try here on this. So this is the translate ID operation. Again, it's a proposed operation. It's not in the spec anywhere. You'll never find this. You won't find this anywhere except on Peter Jordan's Termin server right now. But there is a JIRA ticket out to include it, and Vocabulary is just voted to approve. Well, we're getting ready to vote. We're slated it for a vote. We haven't actually approved it yet, but we probably will. So if we ask to translate the ID, we give it the OID, and we say the source is an OID, and our target is we want to get the URI. So then we should be able to get that, right? So if we do that, And it's the output simple, so we should be able to read it. It's not very big. Let me make it bigger. Okay. So anyway, so it looks just like the preferred ID, really, operation. We get back to the SNOMED URL as we would expect. Okay. But the other thing, so well, if we wanted to do it in reverse, that was OID to URL. We wanted to do URL to OID. So we just flip things around, but we give it again the SNOMED URL. And then there's a question about whether in all servers, whether you should, go ahead and embed the full, the standard URL into the query string or escape it. And in this case, I tried it both ways and it doesn't make any difference. So I just want to let you know that it's not just a matter of it's not escaped correctly. But anyway, if we ask it, if we give it the SNOMED URL, we say, I'm giving you the URI and I want to get the OID back. Question is, should we be able to do this? I'm curious if anybody has an opinion. Do you think that should work? You can probably guess what's going to happen when I do this, but I will, when I do it, what Peter's server returns to me is this. He says, matching naming system not found. So I get the operation outcome for that. Now that's, in my opinion, that's not what I would expect. And I haven't had a chance to run this by Peter, but I think it's just something he hasn't implemented fully yet. But to me, it seems like this should work. I should be able to ask it, the translation ID should be workable in either way. Because there's no ordering, particularly in the naming system. In ConceptMap, we do have an ordering. We have a explicit source code and a target code, and they're not reversible. They're unidirectional, but there's nothing in naming system that implies a direction. So I believe I should be able to go from OID to URI or from URI to OID, but Peter's implementation so far doesn't let me do that. So, all right. I see the green screen lighting up, so we're getting close. I think it's time just to ask for, what are your remaining questions or comments on any of this material. I will say before this is just a very light touch into what is available here with these two resources. And we've just barely scratched, I think, the surface on a lot of it. And a lot of it's pretty nuts and bolts. It's not, stuff that you're going to build into whatever the things are you're doing, but it's just kind of, but hopefully it shows a little bit of what you can, raise the awareness of what's available with these resources and hopefully give you some ideas of what you might be able to do with them. So now, what are the questions or comments that people have? Give you a second. Anything else that you'd like me to show, or you want to? We can play around with some of the queries a little bit and try some different permutations if there's some that you thought of that I haven't shown you here. See what the servers will do. If you want to exercise things a little bit more that way, we can do that. Any ideas?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I guess the question is you're very quiet though. I can speak up a little bit.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is the ConceptMap, is that something you would use eventually to go from a logical model in Fire to make the connection with a profiled resource, stuff like that?
Okay, so going from a Fire logical model to a profiled resource, that's, I don't have to think about that one maybe a little.
You got me thinking, because you said in a structure definition, everything can be a code. And then I thought,
right.
Maybe you can use that to make the connection. I
think the answer should be yes. I'd be curious about if other folks have any opinions on that. I'm pretty sure I've never heard that question asked before. I'm not, but yeah, Fire logical models, we use the Fire infrastructure, but we, define them typically largely at a somewhat higher level. And but yeah, I think you could take constructs in a Fire logical model in a structure definition and map them to, actual profiled resources. I see no reason why you couldn't do that.
Yeah, that always annoyed me that there was not a clear link between the two of them. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. insight. I think it's something to be worth exploring. I don't know if you want to try to do that. Yeah, but I think the answer should be yes. Anybody else have an opinion on that? Well, that's about the sum of my knowledge of it in any way, but yeah, I think you're on the right track with that. It sounds like something that might turn out to be fairly useful.
I have
Other
posted
questions?
2 questions
Yeah.
in the chat.
Oh,
Anyway,
let me
okay.
get to see if I can find the chat here. Just a second. Maybe somebody can read the question while I'm trying to find
So
it.
the question is, I have a question. In a clinical environment, we have to phase out the problem of the identification of a master identifier for a patient. A naming system could be used to achieve this task. In what way we have to identify a master identifier? I think this seems to be confounding something different, but maybe you have a stab at that, Rob?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think it is talking about something a little bit different.
So there's a follow-up. There's a follow-up in the resources. We use the coded system, but the concept map uses the value set as target and source for the translate operation. Do we have the possibility to translate through a code system?
Yes, the answer, well, so we got 2 questions. Let me see if I can answer the first one.
2 questions. 2 questions.
Okay. Well, let me stick on the first one just for a second, the one about master patient identifier. Yeah, I think what naming system would be talking about would be systems of identifiers that say this is a master patient identifier, and there might be more than one way to refer to that in your own local system or whatever. And if you had an identifier type for master patient, you could use naming system to say there's more than one way to reference that set of things, but it wouldn't be getting you down to the identifier for an individual patient. That's not what naming system would do. It's talking about the identifier system. So I think that's the answer to the first question. Now the second one, can you restate it again?
In the resources, we use the coded system, but the concept map uses the value set as a target and source for the translate operation. Yeah. Do we have the possibility to translate through a code system?
Okay, so yes, the answer is yes. And let's see if I can show you why it's yes. Let's get back to the right spot here.
We've got 3 minutes left.
Okay. Won't take too long on this. So basically, I think what we're referring to is, again, what I showed, sorry, jumping around too. Okay. So we have source and target elements which reference value set, and the URI could be any URI, but it's supposed to be the source value set, and here the target value set. Okay, so this gets to what I was saying earlier, and well, again, I'll also mention group. You got the group source, you got URI and group target, and those are codes to the code system because they're separate groups of codes that may be inside your value sets, because you could have more than one code system in a value set, that sort of thing. That's where group could come in and be handy. But when we're talking at this level, these value sets could be the value set URLs that represent all the codes in the code system. So if that's the context that works for your application, that's perfectly fine. So you can actually use ConceptMap then to translate a code, code on a code system basis to a code in another code system. Or as actually Peter Williams in the session earlier on SNOMED, he showed they use concept maps to translate from SNOMED codes to other ones. So basically the historical association. So a retired SNOMED code then has a mapping using, they can use concept map for this to get to the replacement code. So the answer is, so basically it's a very long-winded way to say the answer is yes.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So we'll stay on for an extra 5 minutes to answer any questions in the chat, but I'd like you to give feedback to the talk. That would be great. Usually I'd be saying have a safe trip home, but you're probably all at home.
Yeah.
So you can enjoy a weekend watching the recordings of the talks. You'll be able to watch them. And so Rob and I will be staying here for the next 5 minutes to answer questions, usually in the chats, but I think we can just take a few questions. Yeah, if that's okay for you, Rob, for the just
Oh, yes,
5
that's
minutes,
fine. Absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll just watch and see if anything else comes up.
Well, while we're waiting, definitely appreciate everyone being here and engaging and asking questions and being a part of this. And if there's further things that, you know, something comes to mind later, feel free to ask on Zulip or send an email or whatever is your preferred method there. But keep exploring all these things.
You'll be able to follow up both on Wova as well as on probably the best thing is to do that on Zulip.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that question regarding the connecting the terminology server to the Fire server. So I think that depends on what you want to integrate. So I only know that how that works in Fonk. So which Fire terminology service you want to integrate can be specified. So you could, for example, specify in the settings, the logging server or onto server. And the operations a given service supports and which service should have priority in general can be, or which code system can have priority. You could define that and you would redirect them to whatever service you define. Yeah. So in Fonk, you can redirect, expand, lookup, code system, validate code, translate and subsumes. Yeah. But then there's an issue actually. So we use the Fire mapper, which is also a C# implementation. I think that was Morten's question regarding mappings. Okay. So I know that in Fonk, the service which is responsible to access external terminology services is not accessible to plugins, and the mapper is a Fonk plugin, So it depends on what system and server you're using. I wouldn't know how that would work in Happy.
Yeah, Happy is trying to do some things, you know, to be able to do redirects essentially to other terminology servers, like particularly Onto server is one of the main obvious ones to use. It's a very powerful, rich server, particularly if you were trying to work with Snowbit CT and all of that. Yeah. I think that this is a notion of, well, it might have different terms, but we've kind of called it federated terminology services. And we're hoping to test this in the Connectathons. It's been one of our themes for the last couple of Connectathons on the terminology services track. We're definitely targeting it. We'd like to get, if folks are interested and want to participate, we'd like to do more on that in January at the Connectathon. We just put in the proposal for that actually just yesterday. And I don't remember, I'm pretty sure that's called out in there. We can add it if it isn't, but I think it is. And I think this is going to be an important way of accessing terminology services in the future. We have a general purpose Fire server that then uses a specialized terminology server to get more detailed terminology content and robustness. You know, leave that up to the guys who really do it well. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it seems as though no further questions are coming up. So I think
okay.
I usually watch the chats here, but and see if something new is coming in. Because in the Wova, you don't see, you don't really see during the session, you don't really see the chat. And then when you leave the session, you don't see the chat. So sometimes you follow up there. Yeah, so thanks a lot, Rob. Great talk, great insights. I'll post you the chat log. Just send it to you to mail, and there's something new coming in. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right.
That's good.
All right, thanks everyone. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks a lot to everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.